My name is Pat Tully from the Ketchikan Public Library, and this is Reading Aloud. This evening I'll be reading two essays, one by Robert Louis Stevenson and the other by Leigh Hunt, who we read last week. Robert Louis Stevenson was born in 1850 in Edinburgh, Scotland, and he's best known for the adventure stories Treasure Island and Kidnapped, and of course for The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This evening I'm going to be reading his essay, Books Which Have Influenced Me. The editor has somewhat insidiously laid a trap for his correspondence. The question put appearing at first so innocent, truly cutting so deep. It is not, indeed, until after some reconnaissance and review that the writer awakes to find himself engaged upon something in the nature of autobiography, or, perhaps worse, upon a chapter in the life of that little beautiful brother whom we all once had, and whom we have all lost and mourned, the man we ought to have been, the man we hoped to be. But when word has been passed, even to an editor, it should, if possible, be kept. And if sometimes I am wise and say too little, and sometimes weak and say too much, the blame must lie at the door of the person who entrapped me. The most influential books, and the truest in their influence, are works of fiction. They do not pin the reader to a dogma which he must afterwards discover to be inexact and unlearn. They repeat, they rearrange, they clarify the lessons of life. They disengage us from ourselves, they constrain us to the acquaintance of others, and they show us the web of experience, not as we can see it for ourselves, but with a singular change, that monstrous consuming ego of ours being, for the nonce, struck out. To be so, they must be reasonably true to the human comedy, and any work that is so serves the turn of instruction. But the course of our education is answered best by those poems and romances where we breathe a magnanimous atmosphere of thought and meet generous and pious characters. Shakespeare has served me best. Few living friends have had upon me an influence so strong for the good as Hamlet or Rosalind. That last character, already well beloved in the reading, I had the good fortune to see, I must think, in an impressionable hour, played by Mrs. Scott Siddons. Nothing has ever more moved, more delighted, more refreshed me. Nor has the influence quite passed away. Kent's brief speech over the dying Lear had a great effect upon my mind, and was the burden of my reflections for long, so profoundly, so touchingly generous did it appear in sense, so overpowering in expression. Perhaps my dearest and best friend outside of Shakespeare is D'Artagnan, the elderly D'Artagnan of the Vicomte de Bragelonne. I know not a more human soul, nor in his way a finer. I shall be very sorry for the man who is so much of a pedant in morals that he cannot learn from the captain of musketeers. Lastly, I must name Pilgrim's Progress, a work that breathes of every beautiful and valuable emotion. But of works of art little can be said. Their influence is profound and silent, like the influence of nature. They mold by contact. We drink them up like water, and are bettered, yet know not how. It is in books more specifically didactic that we can follow out the effect, and distinguish and weigh and compare. A book which has been very influential upon me fell early into my hands, and so may stand first, though I think its influence was only sensible later on, and perhaps still keeps growing, for it is a book not easily outlived. The Essays of Montaigne. That temperate and genial picture of life is a great gift to place in the hands of persons today. They will find in these smiling pages a magazine of heroism and wisdom, all of an antique strain. They will have their linen decencies and excited orthodoxies fluttered, and will, if they have any gift of reading, perceive that these have not been fluttered without some excuse and ground of reason. And, again, if they have any gift of reading, they will end by seeing this old gentleman was in a dozen ways a finer fellow, and held in a dozen ways a nobler view of life than they or their contemporaries. The next book in order of time to influence me was the New Testament, and in particular the Gospel according to St. Matthew. I believe it would startle and move anyone if they could make a certain effort of imagination and read it freshly like a book, not droningly and dully like a portion of the Bible. Anyone would then be able to see in it those truths which we are all courteously supposed to know and all modestly refrain from applying. But upon this subject it is perhaps better to be silent. I come next to Whitman's Leaves of Grass, a book of singular service, a book which tumbled the world upside down for me, blew into space 1,000 cobwebs of genteel and ethical illusion, and having thus shaken my tabernacle of lies, set me back again upon a strong foundation of all the original and manly virtues. But it is, once more, only a book for those who have the gift of reading. I will be very frank. I believe it is so with all good books, except, perhaps, fiction. The average man lives, and must live, so wholly in convention, that gunpowder charges of the truth are more apt to discompose than to invigorate his creed. Either he cries out upon blasphemy and indecency, and crouches the closer round that little idol of part truths and part conveniences, which is the contemporary deity, or he is convinced by what is new, forgets what is old, and becomes truly blasphemous and indecent himself. New truth is only useful to supplement the old. Rough truth is only wanted to expand, not to destroy, our civil and often elegant conventions. He who cannot judge had better stick to fiction in the daily papers. There he will get little harm, and, in the first at least, some good. Close upon the back of my discovery of Whitman, I came under the influence of Herbert Spencer. No more persuasive rabbi exists, and few better. How much of his vast structure will bear the touch of time, how much is clay and how much brass, it were too curious to inquire. But his words, if dry, are always manly and honest. There dwells in his pages a spirit of highly abstract joy, plucked naked like an algebraic symbol, but still joyful, and the reader will find there a caput mortuum of piety, with little indeed of its loveliness, but with most of its essentials. And these two qualities make him a wholesome, as his intellectual vigor makes him a bracing, writer. I should be much of a hound if I lost my gratitude to Herbert Spencer. Goethe's Life by Lewes had a great importance for me when it first fell into my hands. A strange instance of the partiality of man's good and man's evil. I know no one whom I less admire than Goethe. He seems a very epitome of the sins of genius, breaking open the doors of private life and wantonly wounding friends, in that crowning offense of Werther, and in his own character a mere pen and ink Napoleon, conscious of the rights and duties of superior talents, as a Spanish inquisitor was conscious of the rights and duties of his office. And yet in his fine devotion to his art, in his honest and serviceable friendship for Schiller, what lessons are contained! Biography, usually so false to its office, does here for once perform for us some of the work of fiction, reminding us, that is, of the truly mingled tissue of man's nature, and how huge faults and shining virtues cohabit and persevere in the same character. History serves us well to this effect, but in the originals, not in the pages of the popular epistemizer, who is bound, by the very nature of his task, to make us feel the difference of epochs, instead of the essential identity of man, and even in the originals only to those who can recognize their own human virtues and defects in strange forms, often inverted and under strange names, often interchanged. Martial is a poet of no good repute, and it gives a man new thoughts to read his works dispassionately, and find in this unseemly jester's serious passages the image of a kind, wise, and self-respecting gentleman. It is customary, I suppose, in reading Marshall, to leave out these pleasant verses. I never heard of them, at least, until I found them for myself, and this partiality is one among 1,000 things that help to build up our distorted and hysterical conception of the great Roman Empire. This brings us by a natural transition to a very noble book, the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. The dispassionate gravity, the noble forgetfulness of self, the tenderness of others, that are there expressed and were practiced on so great a scale in the life of its writer, make this book a book quite by itself. No one can read it and not be moved. Yet it scarcely or rarely appeals to the feelings, those very mobile, those not very trusty parts of man. Its address lies further back. Its lesson comes home, more deeply home. When you have read, you carry away with you a memory of the man himself. It is as though you had touched a loyal hand, looked into brave eyes, and made a noble friend. There is another bond on you thenceforward, binding you to life and to the love of virtue. Wordsworth should perhaps become next. Everyone has been influenced by Wordsworth, and it is hard to tell precisely how. A certain innocence, a rugged austerity of joy, a sight of the stars, the silence that is in the lonely hills, something of the cold thrill of dawn, cling to his work and give it a particular address to what is best in us. I do not know that you will learn a lesson. You need not. Mill did not agree with any one of his beliefs, and yet the spell is cast. Such are the best teachers. A dogma learned is only a new error. The old one was perhaps as good, but a spirit communicated is a perpetual possession. These best teachers climb beyond teaching to the plane of art. It is themselves and what is best in themselves that they communicate. I should never forgive myself if I forgot the egoist. It is art, if you like, but it belongs purely to didactic art, and from all the novels I have read, and I have read thousands, stands in a place by itself. Here is a Nathan for the modern David. Here is a book to send the blood into men's faces. Satire, the angry picture of human faults, is not great art. We can all be angry with our neighbor. What we want is to be shown not his defects, of which we are too conscious, but his merits, to which we are too blind. And the egoist is a satire. So much must be allowed, but it is a satire of a singular quality, which tells you nothing of that obvious mote, which is engaged from first to last with that invisible beam. It is yourself that is hunted down. These are your own faults that are dragged into the day and numbered, with lingering relish, with cruel cunning and precision. A young friend of Mr. Meredith's, as I have the story, came to him in an agony. "This is too bad of you," he cried. "Willoughby is me." "No, my dear fellow," said the author, "he is all of us." I have read The Egoist 5 or 6 times myself, and I mean to read it again, for I am like the young friend of the anecdote. I think Willoughby an unmanly but very serviceable exposure of myself. I suppose when I am done I shall find that I have forgotten much that was most influential. As I see already, I have forgotten Thoreau, and Hazlitt, whose paper On the Spirit of Obligations was a turning point in my life, and Penn, whose little book of aphorisms had a brief but strong effect on me, and Mitford's Tale of Old Japan, wherein I learned for the first time the proper attitude of any rational man to his country's laws, a secret found and kept in the Asiatic islands. That I should commemorate all is more than I can hope or the editor could ask. It will be more to the point, after having said so much upon improving books, to say a word or two about the improvable reader. The gift of reading, as I have called it, is not very common, nor very generally understood. It consists, first of all, and a vast intellectual endowment, a free grace I find I must call it, by which a man rises to understand that he is not punctually right, nor those from whom he differs absolutely wrong. He may hold dogmas, he may hold them passionately, and he may know that others hold them but coldly, or hold them differently, or hold them not at all. Well, if he has the gift of reading, these others will be full of meat for him. They will see the other side of the propositions and the other side of virtues. He need not change his dogma for that, but he may change his reading of that dogma, and he must supplement and correct his deductions from it. A human truth, which is always very much a lie, hides as much of life as it displays. It is men who hold another truth, or, as it seems to us perhaps, a dangerous lie, who can extend our restricted field of knowledge and rouse our drowsy consciences. Something that seems quite new, or that seems insolently false or very dangerous, is the test of a reader. If he tries to see what it means, what truth excuses it, he has the gift, and let him read. If he is merely hurt or offended or exclaims upon the author's folly, he had better take to the daily papers. He will never be a reader. And here, with the aptest illustrative force, after I have laid down my part truth, I must step in with its opposite. For, after all, we are vessels of a very limited content. Not all men can read all books. It is only in a chosen few that any man will find his appointed food, and the fittest lessons are the most palatable, and make themselves welcome to the mind. A writer learns this early, and it is his chief support. He goes on unafraid, laying down the law, and he is sure at heart that most of what he says is demonstrably false, and much of it a mingled strain, and some hurtful, and very little good for service. But he is sure besides that when his words fall into the hands of any genuine reader, they will be weighed and winnowed, and only that which suits will be assimilated. And when they fall into the hands of one who cannot intelligently read, they will come there quite silent and inarticulate, falling upon deaf ears, and his secret is kept as if he had not written. The end. So the second essay this evening is by Leigh Hunt. Last week we read my books, and this week we are going to read a classic. You may have already read this already in school. It is a perfect example of a familiar essay, which is an essay that reads as though you're in the same room as the author and you're talking about things that we all have experienced. So it is with this essay, Getting Up on Cold Mornings. It was written in the 1840s. An Italian author, Giulio Cordara, a Jesuit, has written a poem upon insects, which he begins by insisting that those troublesome and abominable little animals were created for our annoyance, and that they were certainly not inhabitants of paradise. We of the North may dispute this piece of theology, but on the other hand, it is as clear as the snow on the housetops that Adam was not under the necessity of shaving, and that when Eve walked out of her delicious bower, she did not step upon ice 3 inches thick. Some people say it is a very easy thing to get up of a cold morning. You have only, they tell you, to take the resolution, and the thing is done. This may be very true, just as a boy at school has only to take a flogging, and the thing is over. But we have not at all made up our minds upon it, and we find it is a very pleasant exercise to discuss the matter candidly before we get up. This, at least, is not idling, though it may be lying. It affords an excellent answer to those who ask how lying in bed can be indulged in by a reasoning being, a rational creature. How? Why, with the argument calmly at work in one's head, and the clothes thrown over one's shoulder. Oh, it is a fine way of spending a sensible, impartial half hour. If these people would be more charitable, they would get on with their argument better. But they are apt to reason so ill, and to assert so dogmatically, that one could wish to have them stand round one's bed of a bitter morning, and hiss before their faces. They ought to hear both sides of the bed, the inside and the out. If they cannot entertain themselves with their own thoughts for half an hour or so, it is not the fault of those who can. Candid inquiries into one's decumbency, besides the greater or less privileges to be allowed a man in proportion to his ability of keeping early hours, the work giving his faculties, etc., will at least concede their due merits to such representations as the following. In the first place, says the injured but calm appealer, I have been warm all night, and find my system in a state perfectly suitable to a warm-blooded animal. To get out of this state into the cold, besides the inharmonious and uncritical abruptness of the transition, is so unnatural to such a creature, that the poets, refining upon the tortures of the damned, make one of their greatest agonies consist in being suddenly transported from heat to cold, from fire to ice. They are haled out of their beds, says Milton, by harpy-footed furies, fellows who come to call on them. On my first movement toward anticipation of getting up, I find that such parts of the sheets and bolster as are exposed to the air of the room are stone cold. On opening my eyes, the first thing that meets them is my own breath rolling forth, as if in the open air, like smoke out of a chimney. Think of this symptom. Then I turn my eyes sideways and see the window all frozen over. Think of that. Then the servant comes in. It is very cold this morning, is it not? Very cold, sir. Very cold indeed, isn't it? Very cold indeed, sir. More than usually so, isn't it? Even for this weather? Here the servant's wit and good nature are put to a considerable test, and the inquirer is on thorns for the answer. Why, sir, I think it is. Good creature, there's not a better or more truth-telling servant going. I must rise, however. Get me some warm water. Here comes a fine interval between the departure of the servant and the arrival of the hot water, during which, of course, it is no use to get up. The hot water comes. Is it quite hot? Yes, sir. Perhaps too hot for shaving? I must wait a little? No, sir, it will just do. There is an over-nice propriety sometimes, an officious zeal of virtue, a little troublesome. Oh, the shirt. You must air my clean shirt. Linen gets very damp in this weather. Yes, sir. Here another delicious 5 minutes. A knock at the door. Oh, the shirt. Very well. My stockings. I think the stockings had better be aired too. Very well, sir. Here another interval. At length everything is ready except myself. I now, continues our incumbent, a happy word by the by for a country vicar, I now cannot help thinking a good deal, who can, upon the unnecessary and villainous custom of shaving. It is a thing so unmanly, here I nestle closer, so effeminate, here I recoil from an unlucky step into the colder part of the bed. No wonder that the Queen of France took part with the rebels against that degenerate king, her husband, who first affronted her smooth visage with a face like her own. The Emperor Julian never showed the luxuriancy of his genius to better advantage than in reviving the flowing beard. Look at Cardinal Bembo's picture, at Michelangelo's, at Titian's, at Shakespeare's, at Fletcher's, at Spencer's, at Chaucer's, at Alfred's, at Plato's. I could name a great man for every tick of my watch. Look at the Turks, a grave and otiose people. Think of Harun al-Rashid and bedridden Hassan. Think of Wortley Montague, the worthy son of his mother, above the prejudice of his time. Look at the Persian gentleman, whom one is ashamed of meeting about the suburbs. Their dress and appearance are so much finer than our own. Lastly, think of the razor itself. How totally opposed to every sensation of bed. How cold, how edgy, how hard. How utterly different from anything like the warm, encircling amplitude, which sweetly recommends itself unto our gentle senses. Add to this benumbed fingers, which may help you to cut yourself, a quivering body, a frozen towel, a ewer full of ice, and he that says there is nothing to oppose in all this only shows that he has no merit in opposing it. Thomson, the poet, who exclaims in his Seasons, "Falsely luxurious, will not man awake," used to lie in bed till noon, because he said he had no motive in getting up. He could imagine the good of rising, but then he could also imagine the good of lying still. And his exclamation, it must be allowed, was made upon summertime, not winter. We must proportion the argument to the individual character. A money-getter may be drawn out of his bed by 3 or 4 pence, but this will not suffice for a student. A proud man may say, "What shall I think of myself if I don't get up?" But the more humble one will be content to waive this prodigious notion of himself, out of respect to his kindly bed. The mechanical man shall get up without any ado at all, and so shall the barometer. An ingenious liar in bed will find hard matter of discussion even on the score of health and longevity. He will ask us for our proofs and precedents of the ill effects of lying later in cold weather, and sophisticate much on the advantages of an even temperature of body, of the natural propensity, pretty universal, to have one's way, and of the animals that roll themselves up and sleep all winter. As to longevity, he will ask whether the longest is of necessity the best, and whether Holborn is the handsomest street in London. The end. Thank you so much for tuning in. Have a wonderful week.